that?
Yeah, Prof, just because the student is ready to listen to this material, your presentation, so the time is yours, Prof.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I will make this a little bit shorter because we're quite a lot later than we expected. I'll just introduce myself. So I'm an associate professor in forensic linguistics at RMIT University, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. And I'm also the immediate past president of the International Association of Forensic Linguists. Doesn't seem to allow me to, okay. So I'll just tell you a little bit about why linguistic research can be applied to the law and why it's important. So we have now a global context where we have many multilingual and multi-ethnic communities all around the world. But we have a problem because our justice systems are typically designed around an idea of homogeneity and monolingualism. And many countries have inherited their justice system from colonial powers. And the colonial justice systems can replace or work alongside or combine with existing justice systems. And that those options can change over time. So you can have a complexity and dynamic change in the legal systems, but also you have complexity and dynamic change in language systems. So the linguists are like the oil in the machine that helps things to run more smoothly. And I'll show you through this presentation some of the ways that we can do this important work. I'll just give you a little history of forensic linguistics, where it came from. I'll talk to you about what expert evidence and linguistic evidence is, the kind of training that you need to become a forensic linguist, and the kinds of work that linguists do in the justice system and how we can improve the engagement of linguists in the justice system. So let me tell you a little story. In 1950, Timothy John Evans was hanged for the murders of his wife and child at 10 Rillington Place, London. Evans had maintained his innocence and he accused John Reginald Halliday Christie of committing the crimes, despite the fact that the police were able to produce an allegedly verbatim record of Evans confessing to the murders in his police interview. In a dramatic turn of events, the Swedish linguist Jan Svartvik showed in 1968, so 18 years later, that the confession that was used to convict Evans was most likely the product of police influence, and it differed sharply in style and structure from the remainder of Evans's statements. Svartvik, 1968, was able to show, excuse me, using, sorry, it's too many almonds, it's not the coronavirus. Svartvik was able to show, using linguistic analysis of the discourse structures, that the key sections of the statement where Evans apparently confesses to the murders are written using a formal register, which is typical of police texts, but is not typical of the speech of Evans and was inconsistent with the remainder of the interview transcript. Evans was posthumously pardoned, so he was pardoned after his death, and they found several more bodies which were discovered at the place where he had lived, and Christie instead was hanged. So what did this case involve for the linguist? There was the syntactic structure, there was an analysis of style, register, spoken language versus written language, and there was knowledge of the specific police register used in statement taking. What we didn't have was the analysis of vocal qualities, and that kind of forensic linguistic analysis has become much more common. And it wasn't really an authorship analysis either. It wasn't about who wrote the letter or trying to find an author. It was about whether the writing was consistent with his style. So what is expert evidence? Experts are called upon by the court to provide and interpret specialised knowledge about the case. And the forensic part refers to a close examination of the evidence by a specialist. So we have some traditional forensics like pathologists, geneticists, fingerprinting experts, ballistics. These are the more traditional forensics, the ones you'll see on the television. And then perhaps psychiatrists, accountants, entomologists and engineers, they're also quite common. When a building collapses, they call in a forensic engineer, for example. When there's tax evasion or tax fraud, then forensic accountants will be brought in. But forensic linguists are not often recognised. However, their work is often taken for granted. There's an assumption by many justice systems that someone is doing that kind of forensic analysis of language. For example, identifying the author of a document or identifying the speaker. So what is linguistic evidence? We've talked about authorship, we've talked about speech analysis. So these are some type, certainly these are types of linguistic evidence that are quite common. But then you can also have linguistic evidence about cross-cultural pragmatics, and authorship can relate to proficiency. So whether someone was the author of a document might be determined by how proficient they are. Language acquisition theory and research findings would be relevant to that kind of analysis. You would need proficiency scoring systems and language testing. Speaker identification can relate to cross-cultural communication, pragmatics and code switching. So there's lots of different aspects of linguistics that are relevant. Forensic linguists might become involved in cases where there's a misunderstanding in an intercultural speech setting, especially a police interview or a court case, and that has an impact on the trial. In Australia, Professor Diana Eads has done a lot of work on Aboriginal English coming into contact with the Australian justice system. Forensic linguists also become involved where there's some dispute over the proficiency of a speaker, usually the accused. There might also be forensic linguistic analysis when there's a dispute over the identity of a speaker or writer, and this might relate to refugee status. There's been some very controversial linguistic assessment used in Australia in the past to try to work out where someone comes from on the basis of their language. And if you know anything about linguistics, you would know that that's not going to be very reliable. So Tim McNamara from the University of Melbourne worked with the Swiss government to develop some best practice guidelines about how to do that kind of language testing. So what kind of training is required? Well, if you want to give evidence in court, a forensic linguist needs a PhD specialising in the relevant type of analysis. So for example, if you're doing voice identification, so you're trying to work out if the voice on a threatening tape recording was that of the defendant, we would also call that maybe forensic phonetics. You would need to have a qualification in the general linguistics. You need to understand all types of language analysis, but especially phonetics and phonology. Author identification, so that's working out who wrote a particular text by comparing it to known writing samples of the suspect. Well, you would need to have your qualifications in general linguistics again, but especially syntax. If you want to find out more about forensic linguistics, I suggest the IAFL website, which is www.iafl.org. And there's lots of information there. And there's a journal called the International Journal of Speech, Language and the Law. And it's accessible here. You can see this, there's a link here to the journal. And that obviously has a lot of articles about forensic linguistics. Okay, so as well as giving evidence in court, a lot of people who work in the area of language and the law are engaged in addressing injustice in many places in the legal system. And this is what makes it really attractive to a lot of students. A lot of students would like to use their linguistic training to help people who are in trouble with the law or to create a fairer society. For example, we have a lot of people in forensic linguistics working on police interviewing, like my good colleague Dian, who was on the call. Courtroom discourse is also a very popular topic. So things like jury directions and judges' decisions, the communication of rights, interpreting and translating. And I'm going to now look at each one of these in a little bit more detail so you can understand a bit more about them. So police interviewing. A lot of linguists have been concerned with the way that police interviewers ask questions. Are the questions clear? Are they fair? Are they coercive? Linguists are also concerned with how witnesses and suspects respond to the questions. Can they give their version of events? Do they provide narrative responses, long stories in their responses? How do they resist police coercion or control? One thing that's really important if you're interested in an area like police interviewing, you really need to understand how the police are trained. So I've worked a lot with police academies around the world to understand how they're training their police. And then I try to advise them on how they can use their existing training to improve the way that they're using questions. And that's based on linguistic research about how language works. In courtroom discourse, people are interested in, for example, comprehension issues and legal language, directions to juries. And I don't know how relevant that is in Indonesia, but there's a lot of work, a lot of research has been done in that area in other countries. The judge's decisions. When the judge makes their decision, they issue a written statement, and there's a lot of analysis of how judges consider linguistic evidence or language issues. And this is a really useful corpus because it tells you something about how this very important institution, the judge who represents the justice system, how do they understand language? For example, is the judge talking about issues like cross-cultural communication, or are they relying on some, misconceptions about language that are not very scientific? The communication of rights. So when someone is interviewed by the police, they are usually given some kinds of rights. They might have a right to silence. They might have a right to a legal assistance. They might have a right to take a break or to have access to their children. So there are various rights that somebody has. We have the thing in the United States called the Miranda warning, and that might be the term that you're familiar with because it's become a kind of international term. But these cautions are given to suspects before they're interviewed. And it's really important that the suspect understands those rights. So there's a lot of research about the comprehension of the language that's used to communicate the rights to the suspect. How easily can people actually understand what's said? and how easily can they actually access their rights. So when you access your rights in a police interview, you have to use language to do that. So how can you do that if you're a suspect? And a linguist can look at the way that someone accesses their rights using language. Another issue that's been important is what actually constitutes a non-response. When does somebody use their right to silence? And it's not a straightforward thing. If somebody says no comment, is that silence? Is that the same as silence? And what happens if you don't answer a question? Does that mean that does the court think that you're guilty? So do we have a question? Okay, I'll keep going. And there's a particular project in Australia in the Northern Territory where they recorded the caution in lots of Aboriginal languages. It's a very interesting project, and if you're interested in the way that language works in a legal context and in a multilingual context, then I suggest you have a look at that. And of course, there's a lot of research on interpreting and translating in legal contexts, and I'm sure that you can understand how important it is that people have access to interpreters in the legal system, especially in a country like Indonesia and Australia. It's the same. We have many people who speak different languages. Not everybody speaks the same language. We need to be able to identify multilingual speakers and provide the right interpreter. That this is a job for a linguist. We need to have professional standards for interpreters. It can't just be anybody being an interpreter. You can't just have, you know, a murder suspect using their child as an interpreter. That's not appropriate. And we need to have professional treatment of interpreters. They are professionals. They need to be treated like professionals. So the interpreting practice is also a focus for forensic linguists. For example, what mode of interpreting is best? Is it better to use simultaneous interpreting or consecutive interpreting? How do we manage the challenges of legal contexts, all that difficult terminology? There's long narratives, long stories. These are very difficult for interpreters. They have to remember so much. There's a lot of jargon, a lot of technical terms. And then you can have conceptual incongruities. What I mean is that you can have a concept like, for example, even an arrest, when the police arrest somebody. Well, that's a legal concept, to arrest somebody. Now, if you are trying to translate that into another language, which is, for example, in Australia, we have Aboriginal languages. They don't have a concept like arrest. It just doesn't exist in that language. So we have to find another way to explain that concept. And then in translation, there are obviously some similar problems, but a lot of times our professionals are asked to do sight translation in interviews or courtrooms. So interpreters have to immediately translate a written document into a verbal form in another language. It's a very difficult thing to do. We can also have the translation of orders or other legal documents in international tribunals. And this particular area is a very hot topic now for a lot of linguists. I think because there's a lot of money involved in trade negotiations. And when you think about these very, very important legal documents that are used in these trade negotiations, and they might be in different languages, and you have to make sure that both versions of the document are exactly the same. Well, if you understand how language works, you'll know how hard that can be, because two languages are never identical. You can never have a perfect translation between two languages. So this can cause some really big legal problems, and there are tribunals all over the world who are dealing with these multi-million-dollar trade deals, and it's all about the language in the legal documents. So if you find that kind of work interesting, I really strongly suggest that you can probably have a very good career in that kind of legal translation. So one last thing that I'll leave you with. I see from my personal perspective, many years working in this field, that there's one problem that comes up again and again, and it's the problem with so-called common knowledge about language in the justice system. What I mean by that is people have a kind of folk understanding about how language works. People, ordinary people who are not trained as linguists, they think they know about language, and I call that common knowledge. You know, everyone knows that, whatever, about language, okay? But this common knowledge about how language works can influence the decision to engage an expert, and it can undermine the expert witness testimony if the judge thinks that he knows everything about language because, well, he speaks language, so of course he understands it. Why is he going to get an expert linguist, you see? So it can be very difficult for a linguist to prove that they are an expert in language analysis when ordinary people think that they're all experts in language. You have to really explain to the court that linguistics is a specialized scientific field of knowledge. It's not just being a speaker of the language. And if you don't have the right kind of expert, then you can have miscarriages of justice and unfair convictions. So I think that it's really important that we address this attitude through forensic linguistics in education. So we need people from high school upwards to understand that linguistics is a specialized field of expertise. We can have generalist linguistics undergraduate courses as well, which introduce, just as you're doing here, introduce the idea of forensic linguistics. And then also in those other courses like languages courses, translating and interpreting, law degrees, criminology and justice university courses, we can also teach those people about forensic linguistics and linguistics in general. And that's what I do in my role at RMIT University. I actually work in a criminology and justice department. I don't work in a linguistics department. So I teach criminology and justice students about linguistics. And then I'll do a lot of professional development for law and justice professionals. So a lot of training with judges and lawyers and police. But, you know, in some ways, I think that's really a bit late to be addressing the problem. I think we need to come in earlier and really aim to introduce linguistics at high school. So like psychology, for example, psychology is a base subject now in so many schools, and mathematics and, you know, other things which are considered base subjects. I really do think that linguistics, understanding how language works, understanding that it is an area of expert specialized knowledge, this is really important in addressing justice in our various countries. So thank you. And I hope that wasn't too much information at this time of night, but do get in touch if you've got any questions. And that's my, you can find me very easily on the RMIT website, and that's my web address there, my website address there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Georgina, for the material that you giving to us. And before we go to the discussion session, I will invite Ibu Dian as a lecturer in forensic linguistics in this forum, also give some comment or some material a little bit about forensic, because Ibu Dian is joined with some research with Georgina before, is it right? Ibu Dian, the time is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ibu Mirsa. Thank you, Georgina, for your interesting talk. Yeah, that's reminds me of my journey when I did my research under your supervision. Yeah, it's a wonderful journey. It's a very yeah, I feel like to do another doctoral study if possible then. Right. So yeah, that's the issue that Georgina addressed with the common knowledge about language is also relevant, yeah, in our context in Indonesia. Yeah, in my study, for example, so as Georgina said, that my research is in the area of police interviewing, and so I observed that the police officer, when they interviewed witnesses or suspects, yeah, and then they find that the witnesses are not speaking the language of the Indonesian language, for example, because that is the official language, yeah, the formal language, yeah. The witness or the suspect speak their local language, yeah. So the police officers often just switch, yeah. So they feel confident that they can, you know, elicit information, yeah, accurately with their ability in speaking the local language of the witnesses or the suspects, yeah. But well, actually, when we talk about the investigative interviewing, especially cognitive interviewing, that there are some, you know, instructions, and it's really you know, tied to the wordings, so it might not work well if the police officer you know, translate, yeah, the instruction by themselves, because my research showed that the cognitive interviewing instruction needs to be you know, translated with by, you know, paying attention to the what's it, the values, yeah, the professionalism values, the formality values, yeah. And it's not, that kind of knowledge is not there, yeah. The police might not understand that. So that is the role of linguist in the legal justice system, as my research showed, is very, very important. And so hopefully,
Dion,
yeah, yes?
Dion, I was just going to say it might be really helpful if you were able to reiterate some of the key concepts that I mentioned, but in Indonesian language, because I know that some of the technical language I was using might not come across very well. Yeah, so maybe if you wanted to do that, I mean, don't use English just on my account, please.
Oh, yeah.
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 Good idea too. That is good idea.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Baik, teman-teman semua, saya panggil teman-teman saja ya, biar kita sama-sama ini terkait dengan linguistik forensik dan perannya dalam sistem hukum kita ini sangat penting ya, terutama tadi yang disampaikan oleh Profesor Georgina ya, terkait dengan kemampuan polisi ya, kemampuan para penegak hukum dalam mengungkap informasi, ya, terutama dalam tadi saya sampaikan dalam setting police interview, ya, wawancara polisi, ya. Jadi di dalam wawancara polisi ini ada yang namanya best practice, ya, ada yang namanya best practice, ya, itu kalau dalam riset saya itu saya menggunakannya wawancara kognitif, ya, itu untuk membantu saksi, ya, agar bisa memberikan keterangan selengkap mungkin, seakurat mungkin, ya. Dan instruksi-instruksi yang digunakan di dalam wawancara kognitif itu tidak mudah diterjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Indonesia, ya. Instruksi-instruksinya itu ada dalam bahasa Inggris dan itu tidak mudah diterjemahkan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Mengapa? Karena yang pertama, misalnya, ya, dalam bahasa Indonesia itu ada sistem personal pronoun, kata ganti. Kata ganti apa yang cocok digunakan oleh polisi, ya, ketika misalnya menyapa para saksi atau tersangka, begitu. Ya, apakah menggunakan kata saudara, apa menggunakan kata bapak atau ibu, ya, atau menggunakan kata Anda. Nah, penggunaan kata-kata itu, ya, melalui riset saya itu terungkap bahwa polisi itu biasa menggunakan kata saudara, ya, atau Anda. Padahal kata-kata itu menjauhkan, ya, membuat jarak, ya, antara si polisi dengan si yang diperiksanya, begitu, ya. Dan yang paling baik dari hasil riset saya adalah dengan menggunakan kata sapaan yang sesuai, ya, dengan lawan bicara kita. Kalau misalnya mereka saksi atau tersangka itu bapak-bapak, ya kita panggil bapak atau kita tanya dulu, ya, berkenannya dipanggil apa, begitu, sehingga tercipta jaraknya itu bisa berkurang, begitu, ya. Jadi dekat lah, begitu, karena intinya dari wawancara kognitif itu adalah memberikan keleluasaan kepada saksi untuk mengungkapkan informasi sebanyak mungkin, gitu, ya. Nah, kalau misalnya polisinya pede sekali dengan kemampuan bahasanya, kemudian menerjemahkannya sendiri, gitu, ya, menggunakan common knowledge-nya sendiri, ini informasi dari saksi dan tersangka itu tidak akan bisa sama hasilnya ketika si polisi ini terinformasi oleh hasil riset dari linguistik forensik, begitu, ya. Jadi ini penting sekali, ya, peran linguistik forensik itu sudah terbukti dalam hal police interview, gitu, ya, dan dalam hal yang lainnya juga, ya, pemberian saksi ahli, gitu, ya, mengidentifikasi siapa penulis surat, gitu, ya, kaleng misalnya, begitu, ya. Nanti kita bisa elaborasi itu nanti di kelas. Baik, mungkin itu Ibu Mirsa yang saya sampaikan, mungkin terlalu banyak. Nanti di kelas aja dilanjutkan.
Biasa sekali Ibu Dian, tambahan dari Ibu Dian. Selanjutnya mahasiswa sudah tidak sabar ini. Georgina, the student is cannot wait to enter to the discussion session. Baik, kepada mahasiswa dipersilahkan. Tadi yang sudah raise hand, silahkan. Meira 1, Indra 1, Valen. Okay, we have 3 questions for the student. Kepada Meira duluan, silakan. Boleh kepada Gina, boleh kepada Bu Dian, bahasa Inggris boleh, silakan.
Ya, terima kasih Bu. Well, thank you very much for the time given to me. My name is Meira. It's so interesting today because we got the presentation sessions regarding the forensic linguistics. I would like to ask to Professor Georgina and also Miss Dian about so. For example, when I am interested to do a research regarding the forensic linguistics, so what I have to do, is it I have to analyze only police interviewing, or I can do analyzing the other legal documents? And then what kinds of the difficulties are found in conducting a research regarding forensic linguistics? Thank you.
Thank you. They're really good questions. Thank you for your questions. No, you don't have to look at police interviewing to do research. There are lots of different aspects of legal language, court language, there's the language in tribunals, there's language of lawyers, there's lots of different aspects in forensic linguistics. And then also there are those core areas of expert testimony like voice identification or the authorship. These are areas that need a lot of research. So if you start to engage with read the literature on forensic linguistics, very quickly you're going to find out what some of the most important questions are that need more research. I think, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Meira? Meira?
She's just putting her headphones in.
Is what kinds of interested to do a research?
Oh, what are the obstacles? Yeah, the difficulties. Yeah, one of the biggest difficulties is getting the data. This is a constant problem for forensic linguistic research, getting access to data. So it's important that you have good connections in your area of interest, and that you find a professor or another researcher who's already working in that area, and use your networks, use your connections to help you to meet the right people. And then, of course, you have to go through an ethics process to get access to the data. It's often difficult, but you can also use laboratory methods. So if you can't get real data, then you can use laboratory methods for doing experimental research.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Next, second question, Indra, please.
Okay, thank you for the time and the opportunity given to me. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Indra Desmantelumbanua. I'm from Nias Island, and my question is it we are talking about forensic linguistics? It means that to provide a careful systemic analysis to prove something that we can be research of the language itself. So my question is, this is related to our major. Our major is linguistic major. So what are the branches we can use as the research in forensic linguistics? Is it appear or suitable for the all branch of the linguistic, or we have to separate all the branches of the linguistic it can be using in the research? It means that when I am interested to do a research in forensic linguistics, that's the first. And the second is, how about the forensic linguistics? It can be applied in ancient traditional, like in our country or in our village. Is it appear or is it does to a connecting forensic linguistic analysis language or not? Thank you.
Yeah, really good questions again. So most of the core areas of linguistics are used in forensic analysis of some form. But of course, if you want to do speaker analysis, then you have to do phonetics and phonology. If you want to do authorship identification, then you really need to specialize in syntax and semantics. If you want to give advice around police interviewing, then you probably need to do discourse analysis, perhaps conversation analysis. So it depends on you know, there's different branches of forensic linguistics, just the same as there are different branches of linguistics. In relation to your second question about traditional areas of justice, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I did some research in Mozambique, and we looked at the way that traditional courts in Mozambique, like tribal courts, were using particular methods of question and answer structure. And so it was discourse analysis. And we looked at how that was, that worked better in some ways than the traditional Portuguese legal system in Mozambique. So absolutely, there's definitely some application. However, I think, you know, forensic linguistics is a science, so it's not going to be helpful in spiritual matters, for example. But if it's a scientific application, then yeah, it can be used.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Ibu Dian, would you like to add something based on Meira and Indra's question?
Ya, terima kasih Bu Mirsa. Terima kasih juga pertanyaan-pertanyaannya ya, luar biasa. Ini saya akan komentari dulu dari Meira ya.
Meira.
Ya, Meira, ini pertanyaannya tadi tentang risetnya apakah harus police interview. Tidak ya, karena memang di dalam linguistik forensik itu kalau bicara lingkupnya itu ada 3 ya. Yang pertama itu terkait dengan bahasa hukum. Jadi bisa juga menganalisis dokumen-dokumen hukum. Ya, bahasa undang-undang misalnya ya. Itu area yang pertama. Yang kedua itu bahasa dalam ranah peradilan. Ya, itu salah satunya, contohnya itu yang police interview itu. Tapi bisa juga yang tadi disebutkan oleh Georgina, ya, bahasa yang digunakan oleh para lawyer, pengacara, ya, penggunaan pertanyaan-pertanyaan hakim misalnya di pengadilan, ya. Nah, itu yang di ranah peradilan. Pokoknya mulai dari penyidikan sampai dengan pengadilan. Itu bahasa-bahasa yang digunakan di situ, itu bisa masuk area penelitian. Yang ketiga itu ranahnya itu linguistic evidence, ya, penggunaan bahasa sebagai alat bukti. Nah, itu yang biasa digunakan oleh para saksi ahli untuk memberikan kesaksian. Itu juga bisa menjadi area untuk riset, ya. Ini banyak sekali misalnya penggunaan bahasa-bahasa bully di media sosial misalnya. Itu menurut saya mungkin lebih visible ya untuk datanya karena ada, maksudnya lebih mudah diakses begitu ya. Jadi memang betul tadi obstacle-nya itu lebih banyak pada data ya, apalagi untuk police interview ya, karena saya sendiri juga ketika mengumpulkan data untuk wawancara polisi itu susah sekali, sehingga saya menggunakannya teknik lain ya, tidak mendapatkan data alamiah ya, tapi untuk misalnya bahasa courtroom interaction gitu ya, itu lebih mudah ya. Lebih mudah itu karena saya memang pernah melakukannya begitu ya. Jadi kita masukkan surat izin penelitian ke pengadilan gitu ya, nanti sebutkan tujuan kita mau apa, menginterview hakim atau misalnya mau ikut persidangan. Itu ada persidangan-persidangan yang terbuka, jadi kita bisa juga meminta izin untuk merekam misalnya gitu ya, begitu. Nah, kurang lebih ya. Jadi ada beberapa aspek yang bisa kita lakukan riset begitu ya, tanpa maksudnya untuk menghindari akses data yang sulit begitu ya, bisa ya kita ya. Terus tadi dari Indra tentang linguistik forensik ya, untuk alat analisisnya mungkin ya, yang saya tangkap itu, jadi memang betul ya, tergantung datanya. Kalau misalnya seperti tadi Georgina misalnya melakukannya di Mozambik misalnya, kemudian ada interaksi, itu biasanya menggunakan analisis wacana ya. Kalau misalnya untuk mencari tahu misalnya apa kata-kata ini benar tidak mencemarkan nama baik misalnya begitu ya, nah itu bisa menggunakan pendekatan pragmatik begitu misalnya ya, atau juga sosiolinguistik ya, tergantung. Atau bisa juga menggunakan appraisal misalnya untuk mengukur misalnya attitude dari para perundung ya. Yang perundung itu pembuli ya, bully ya, gitu. Jadi tergantung datanya apa. Jadi nanti kita bisa menggunakan pisau analisisnya yang tepat untuk mengungkap masalah yang dihadapi di ranah hukum, gitu ya.
Ya, Luar biasa Bu Dian. Masih ada 2 penanya, Valentinus Duru dari Nia Selatan dan Kiki Nurwahyuni dari Kendari, Sulawesi Tenggara. Ini mahasiswa kami dari jauh-jauh ini Bu Dian. Ya baik, Valen silakan.
Okay, thanks for the time that has been given to me. My name is Valentinus Duru. I'm from Nias Island. My question is also related to the instrumental analysis, just has been explained by Georgina and Miss Dian. When we want to conduct scientific research on, for example, the courtroom, don't we have to actually we have to capable in any domain? For I mean integrated capability, not only in specific linguistic branches, not only phonology or syntaxis analysis, but we have to capable in any domain, because in that courtroom situation, we don't only analyze about the grammatically sentences, for example, we have to recognize the meaning itself. So what about that? That's all from me. Thank you.
I think that's, thank you for the question. It's what you find in research is that you need area to explore. And so, for example, a lot of work in courtroom analysis is using pragmatics. So the way that people construct meaning in a context. And it's really, you know, by using rules of pragmatics, there's been some analysis of the way that lawyers in court question the accused, for example, you know, what kind of language they're using. Are they using politeness features? Are they using structures which are going to confuse the accused, for example? And so often with a research project, it comes down to a very, very narrow description of a particular linguistic feature, and then many, many examples of the same thing to identify a pattern. And you're using that particular linguistic feature as a heuristic, as a measure of something else. So you know, I think Diane, your research, for example, focused on terms of address, and you used that as a way to explore politeness more broadly, and then you can make some conclusions about politeness, but you've used terms of address as the heuristic, as the measure of politeness. So it's really important to have a broad base in the foundational areas of linguistics, so that you can see broadly what's interesting here, what do I want to look at. But then when you focus, you're going to select one area and read a lot about that, investigate about that, create your experiment relating to that particular branch of linguistics. Yeah?
Ya, saya menambahkan sedikit. Jadi memang kemampuan menguasai semua bidang linguistik itu bagus, ya. Tapi saya melihat pada diri saya sendiri, ya. Saya melihat saya lebih kuat di pragmatics daripada phonetics misalnya begitu. Jadi saya akan melihat area riset yang terkait dengan itu di linguistik forensik, sehingga saya bisa menggunakan alat analisis itu ketika berhadapan dengan data begitu. Ya, jadi misalnya ketika saya pergi ke pengadilan, misalnya masalah apa yang terkait dengan pragmatik di situ, misalnya ya, speech act of request, misalnya order misalnya ya dari judge misalnya gitu. Nah itu kan lebih pragmatik ya, tapi itu nanti dikaitkan dengan isu apa misalnya injustice-nya di situ. Kalau misalnya menggunakan speech act itu misalnya gitu. Jadi saya akan menggunakan kekuatan saya di dalam linguistik itu untuk membantu menganalisis kasus-kasus bahasa di ranah hukum begitu. Mungkin itu yang bisa saya sarankan ya.
Terima kasih Bu Dian, luar biasa tambahan jawabannya. The last question, Kiki, please. Kiki, di unmute dulu deh.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Professor Georgina. I am Kiki Nayuni. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Well, I have one question that always stuck in my mind because as far as I'm concerned that forensic linguistics has a large approach to analyze such as the utterance is uttered by defendants or some who commit a crime during a trial and many examples like that. But as I know that language is not just the utterance that we utter, but there is a language called body language. I mean, like the mimic. This also have an effect in solving a problem in the role of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiki. Your sound was breaking up a little bit for me. I don't know if it's my end, but so I think what you were asking was whether body language and paralinguistics can also be of use in the analysis. Look, I think that body language is so variable. It's not systematic like spoken language. However, there has been some investigation of eye gaze, for example. So where in a conversation, who we're looking at, but also there's some investigation of the vocal qualities. So, you know, speech qualities that are not related to the words, but, you know, the usual kinds of things like pitch and tone and so on. But gesture and the way you're standing and so on is not really useful because it's so idiosyncratic. It's so specific to a person. But as I say, eye gaze has been used in some experimental research. Yeah.
Ya, Kiki?
Ya,
Oke.
body language.
Ya, silakan Bu Dian.
Ya, ini body language juga ini masuknya ke nonverbal mungkin ya, komunikasi nonverbal. Ya, tapi ini banyak sekali penelitian di psikologi ya yang meneliti ini. Misalnya kalau Anda senang nonton Lie to Me ya, micro expression misalnya ya, itu risetnya banyak riset yang mengatakan hasilnya itu pseudo science. Jadi reliabilitasnya dipertanyakan ya. Jadi saya juga pernah mengikuti itu misalnya ya, kan itu juga bisa masuk ekspresi nonverbal begitu ya. Jadi seberapa kalau misalnya sedih atau misalnya marah atau apa bisa dilihatnya biasanya di area mata begitu kan ya. Tapi kan seberapa tinggi dia mengangkat begitu kan itu kan tidak jelas juga ukurannya begitu ya. Jadi memang alat-alat ini tadi seperti Georgina sampaikan ini kurang membantu begitu ya karena memang secara riset juga ini lemah ya gitu. Jadi untuk linguistik forensik ini kita riset-riset juga lebih mengandalkan pada data-data yang tekstual misalnya ya atau oral ya yang jelas ada ininya bukan body language begitu.
Ya, baik, luar biasa Ibu Dian. Dan kepada para mahasiswa semua, apabila masih ada pertanyaan, nanti bisa berkenan Ibu Dian langsung ke Bu Dian atau email ke Prof. Georgina, karena keterbatasan waktu kita pada perkuliahan, maaf, pada matrikulasi kali ini. Karena memang matrikulasi kan baru penyegaran Bu Dian ya, baru memberikan stimulus-stimulus awal, sehingga nanti akan dilanjutkan di perkuliahan yang akan datang. Prof. Georgina, thank you so much, Prof. For the material given to us. Dan sebelum kita akhiri, mohon kepada para mahasiswa untuk membuka videonya, kita akan foto sesi bersama.
Yeah, we'll have to take pictures together.
Ya, Prof. Georgina, take a picture together. Ya, senyum yang bagusnya, smile, smile. 1, 2, 3. Once again. Ya, ya, once again, sorry. Once again, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Bu Dian. And we will see you again in the next event. Thank you.
Okay. All the best. Bye-bye.
Ya, terima kasih. Thank you,
Thank
Georgina.
you, Georgina.
Thank you, Prof.
Silakan kepada Prof.
Thank you, Bu Dian.
Thank you, Bu Dian.
Ya.
Prof. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you juga Ibu Mirsa.